The floorboards creaked in a rhythm that 15-year-old Emma Hartwell had memorized by heart. 3 heavy steps from the kitchen to the hallway, a pause at the bottom of the stairs, then the deliberate climb to the second floor. Each sound meant something different depending on the hour, depending on his mood, depending on how many empty bottles littered the coffee table downstairs. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Tonight, the steps were slow but purposeful. Emma's mother, Sarah, sat frozen at her vanity mirror, her hands trembling as she tried to cover the fresh bruise along her jawline with makeup that had seen better days. The foundation was too light for her complexion, but it was all they could afford, and it would have to do for her shift at the diner tomorrow morning. "He's coming up," Emma whispered from her position by the bedroom door, her ear pressed against the wood. Sarah's reflection met her daughter's eyes in the mirror. At 38, she looked older than her years. The constant fear had etched lines around her eyes that no amount of makeup could conceal. Her once vibrant auburn hair hung limp around her shoulders, and her green eyes held a weariness that seemed to penetrate her very soul. "Get to your room," Sarah mouthed silently, but Emma shook her head. "I'm not leaving you alone with him." The footsteps stopped outside the door. Both women held their breath, counting the seconds in the suffocating silence. Then came the sound they both dreaded, the slow turn of the doorknob. Robert Hartwell filled the doorframe with his imposing 6-foot frame. His dark hair was disheveled, his work clothes stained with grease and sweat from his job at the auto shop, but it was his eyes that made both women instinctively step back, cold, calculating, and filled with a rage that seemed to simmer just below the surface at all times. Well, he said, his voice deceptively calm. "Looks like I've got an audience tonight." Emma positioned herself between her father and mother, her small frame trembling but determined. "Dad, please. Mum's tired. She has to work early tomorrow." Robert's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Oh, she's tired, is she? And what about me? What about the fact that I work 10 hours a day to keep a roof over your ungrateful heads, and I come home to find the house looking like a disaster zone?" Sarah stood up, slowly from the vanity, her movements careful and measured. "I'll clean it up, Robert. I was just getting ready for bed." Getting ready for bed. He stepped into the room, and Emma could smell the alcohol on his breath. "You think you deserve to rest while I'm busting my back to support this family?" The familiar pattern was beginning. Emma had witnessed this dance countless times before, and she knew exactly how it would end. Her father would work himself into a fury, finding fault with anything and everything, until his anger exploded into violence. The only question was whether tonight would be worse than the others. "Dad, please!" Emma tried again, her voice cracking with desperation. "We cleaned all day. The house is fine." Robert's attention shifted to his daughter, and Emma saw something dark flicker in his eyes. "You think you can talk back to me in my own house? You think, because you're getting older, you can protect your mother from me?" The threat hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Emma had turned 15 just last month, and she'd noticed the way her father's attention had begun to linger on her in ways that made her skin crawl. The protective instinct she felt for her mother was now coupled with a growing fear for her own safety. Sarah must have sensed the shift in the room's dynamic, because she quickly moved to place herself between her husband and daughter. "Robert, leave her alone. She's just a child." "A child." Robert's voice rose dangerously. "She's 15 years old, Sarah. Old enough to learn some respect." The first blow came so fast that Sarah barely had time to react. Robert's hand connected with her cheek with a sharp crack that echoed through the small bedroom. She stumbled backward, her hand flying to her face as tears sprang to her eyes. Emma screamed and lunged forward, but Robert caught her wrist in a grip that sent shooting pain up her arm. You want to play the hero, little girl? Maybe it's time you learned what happens to heroes in the real world. The nightmare that followed lasted for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Robert's rage was like a wildfire, consuming everything in its path. Sarah bore the brunt of his fury, as she always did, using her body as a shield to protect Emma from the worst of it. But tonight was different. Tonight, Robert's anger seemed to have no boundaries. When it was finally over, Robert stood in the doorway, breathing heavily, his knuckles bloody. "Clean this mess up," he snarled at Sarah, who was curled on the floor beside the overturned vanity. "And next time, maybe you'll think twice before disrespecting me in my own house." The door slammed shut, leaving mother and daughter alone in the wreckage of their bedroom. Emma rushed to her mother's side, her hands shaking as she tried to assess the damage. Sarah's lip was split, her left eye was already beginning to swell, and Emma could see the dark bruises forming along her ribs where Robert's kicks had landed. "Mum, we have to go to the hospital," Emma whispered, but Sarah shook her head weakly. "No hospitals. You know what happens if we go to the hospital." Emma did know. The last time they'd sought medical attention, Robert had spun a story about Sarah falling down the stairs, and somehow the doctors had believed him. Or maybe they'd simply chosen to believe him because it was easier than dealing with the truth. Either way, nothing had changed, and Robert's anger had only intensified after that incident. "We can't keep living like this," Emma said, helping her mother to the bed. "He's getting worse." Sarah's good eye met her daughter's gaze, and Emma saw a flicker of something she hadn't seen in years: hope. "Maybe you're right," she whispered. "Maybe it's time we found a way out." But even as she spoke the words, they both knew how hollow they sounded. They had no money, no car, and nowhere to go. Robert controlled every aspect of their lives, from the meager paycheck Sarah earned at the diner to the clothes on their backs. He'd isolated them from friends and family over the years, systematically cutting them off from anyone who might help them escape. The next morning dawned grey and overcast, matching the mood that had settled over the small house on Maple Street. Emma helped her mother apply makeup to cover the worst of the bruises, a routine they'd perfected over the years. Sarah's hands were steadier now, but Emma could see the pain in her eyes every time she moved. "I'll walk you to the diner," Emma offered, but Sarah shook her head. "You need to get to school. Your education is the only thing that might get you out of here someday." It was a conversation they'd had many times before. Sarah had dropped out of high school when she got pregnant with Emma, trapping herself in a cycle of dependence that had made it impossible to leave Robert. She was determined that her daughter wouldn't make the same mistakes. Emma gathered her backpack and headed for the door, but she paused at the threshold. "Mom, what you said last. Mightn't about finding a way out. Did you mean it?" Sarah's reflection in the hallway mirror showed a woman who looked defeated, but her voice carried a note of determination that Emma hadn't heard in years. "I meant it, sweetheart. I don't know how yet, but I meant it." The walk to school took Emma through the heart of Cedar Falls, Montana, a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, or at least they thought they did. Emma had become an expert at hiding the truth, at deflecting questions about her mother's frequent accidents and her father's increasingly volatile behavior. Cedar Falls had once been a thriving agricultural community, but the economic downturn of recent years had hit the town hard. Many of the local businesses had closed, leaving behind empty storefronts and a population struggling to make ends meet. The Hartwell family's situation wasn't unique. Domestic violence often flourished in communities where poverty and desperation were common. At school, Emma threw herself into her studies with the same intensity she used to survive at home. Education was her escape, her hope for a future beyond the walls of the house on Maple Street. Her teachers had noticed her academic potential, and several had suggested she consider applying for college scholarships when the time came. But college Felt like an impossible dream when she couldn't even imagine making it through the next week without something terrible happening at home. The bruises on her mother's face were getting harder to hide, and Emma lived in constant fear that one day Robert would go too far, and she'd lose the only person in the world who truly loved her. During lunch period, Emma sat alone in the library, working on a history assignment about the American frontier. She'd always been fascinated by stories of the Old West, of cowboys and pioneers who'd carved out new lives in the wilderness. There was something appealing about the idea of starting over, of leaving everything behind and building something better from nothing. Rough night. Emma looked up to find Mrs. Patterson, the school librarian, standing beside her table. Mrs. Patterson was one of the few adults in Emma's life who seemed to genuinely care about her well-being, and Emma had to fight the urge to confide in her. "Just tired," Emma replied, forcing a smile. "Mom had to work late last night." Mrs. Patterson's expression suggested she wasn't buying the excuse, but she didn't push. Instead, she placed a book on the table beside Emma's assignment. "I thought you might be interested in this. It's about women pioneers in the American West. Some of them faced incredible challenges, but they found ways to survive and build new lives for themselves and their families." Emma glanced at the book's cover, which featured a photograph of a woman in frontier dress standing beside a covered wagon. There was something in the woman's eyes that reminded Emma of her mother. A quiet strength that persisted despite overwhelming odds. "Thank you," Emma said, and she meant it. Books had always been her refuge, her escape from the harsh realities of her daily life. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As the school day ended, Emma dreaded the walk home. The approaching evening meant another night of uncertainty, another night of wondering whether Robert's mood would explode into violence. She took the long way home, delaying the inevitable for as long as possible. When she finally reached Maple Street, she could see her mother's silhouette in the kitchen window, preparing dinner. Sarah worked at the diner from 6 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, then came home to cook and clean for a husband who showed her nothing but contempt. It was a life of endless labor and constant fear, and Emma wondered how her mother found the strength to continue day after day. The front door opened before Emma could reach for the handle, and Robert stepped out onto the porch. His work clothes were cleaner than usual, and he'd apparently showered and shaved. For a moment, Emma allowed herself to hope that perhaps he was making an effort to change, to become the father and husband they desperately needed him to be. "Emma," he said, his voice unusually gentle, "come here, sweetheart. I want to talk to you." Every instinct Emma possessed screamed at her to run, but she forced herself to approach. Running would only make things worse for both her and her mother. "I owe you an apology," Robert continued, placing his hand on her shoulder. "I know I've been under a lot of stress lately, and I've been taking it out on you and your mother. That's not fair, and I'm sorry." The words sounded rehearsed, but Emma wanted so desperately to believe them that she found herself nodding. "It's okay, Dad." "No, it's not okay." His grip on her shoulder tightened slightly. "A man should protect his family, not hurt them." "I want to make it up to you both." Emma's heart began to race, but not with hope. There was something in her father's eyes that didn't match his conciliatory words, something predatory that made her skin crawl. "Why don't you come inside?" Robert suggested. "Your mother's making your favorite dinner, and we can all sit down and talk like a real family." The word family sounded obscene coming from his lips, but Emma had no choice but to follow him into the house. The kitchen smelled of pot roast and vegetables, and under normal circumstances, it would have been comforting. Tonight, it felt like a trap. Sarah looked up from the stove as they entered, and Emma saw the wariness in her mother's eyes. She'd applied fresh makeup to cover the bruises from the night before, but Emma could see the swelling around her left eye that no amount of cosmetics could completely hide. "Dinner smells wonderful, honey," Robert said, moving to stand behind Sarah at the stove. He placed his hands on her shoulders, and Emma saw her mother tense at his touch. "Doesn't it smell good, Emma?" "Yes, Dad." Emma's voice came out as barely a whisper. "I was just telling Emma how sorry I am about last night," Robert continued, his hands beginning to massage Sarah's shoulders. "I think we all need to make more of an effort to be a real family." The word family again. Emma watched her mother's face in the reflection of the kitchen window and saw the fear there. Sarah knew, as Emma did, that Robert's sudden change in demeanor was more dangerous than his obvious rage. When he was openly angry, they knew what to expect. When he was playing the role of the loving husband and father, anything could happen. "Why don't you set the table, Emma?" Sarah suggested, her voice carefully neutral. "Dinner's almost ready." Emma moved to the cabinet to retrieve the plates, grateful for any excuse to put some distance between herself and her father. But as she reached for the dishes, she felt Robert's presence behind her. His body heat seemed to radiate menace, and she could feel his eyes on her in a way that made her stomach turn. "You're growing up so fast," he murmured, close enough that she could feel his breath on her neck. "Sometimes I can hardly believe you're my little girl anymore." Emma's hands shook as she lifted the plates from the cabinet. She wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there and pretend that her father's attention was normal and appropriate. But she'd learned over the years that any reaction from her would only make things worse for her mother. "Robert," Sarah's voice cut through the tension in the room, "could you help me with the roast? It's heavier than I expected." It was a transparent attempt to draw his attention away from Emma, and for a moment Emma thought it might work. But Robert's hand came to rest on her lower back, and she felt him lean closer. "In a minute," he said to Sarah, but his eyes never left Emma. "I'm having a conversation with my daughter." The dinner that followed was a surreal performance of normalcy. Robert played the role of the devoted family man, asking Emma about school and complimenting Sarah on the meal. But beneath the surface, Emma could feel the undercurrents of threat and violence that had become the foundation of their family dynamic. As they ate, Robert regaled them with stories from his work at the auto shop, painting himself as the hard-working provider who sacrificed everything for his family's welfare. Emma had heard these stories before, and she knew they were largely fiction. Robert's co-workers had no respect for him, and his supervisor had warned him multiple times about his attitude and work ethic. "I've been thinking," Robert said as Sarah cleared the dinner plates. "Maybe we should take a family vacation this summer, get away from all the stress, and spend some quality time together." Emma felt her blood run cold. The idea of being trapped in a car or hotel room with her father for days on end was her worst nightmare. She glanced at her mother and saw the same fear reflected in Sarah's eyes. "That sounds wonderful," Sarah said carefully. "But I don't think we can afford a vacation right now." Robert's expression darkened slightly, and Emma saw the familiar warning signs of his mounting anger. "I work hard to provide for this family, Sarah. I think we deserve a little happiness after everything we've been through." "Of course," Sarah agreed quickly. "I just meant that maybe we should wait until we've saved up a little more money." "Money." Robert's voice carried a note of disgust. "Everything always comes back to money with you, doesn't it? Maybe if you worked more hours at that diner, instead of sitting around the house all day, we'd have more money." Emma wanted to point out that her mother worked 6 days a week and spent her only day off cleaning the house and doing laundry. But she bit her tongue. Any defense of her mother would only escalate the situation. "You're right," Sarah said quietly. "I'll talk to my manager about picking up extra shifts." The rest of the evening passed in tense silence. Robert retreated to the living room to watch television and drink beer, while Sarah and Emma cleaned the kitchen together. They worked without speaking, both of them acutely aware that their husband and father was listening to every sound they made. When the dishes were finished, Emma excused herself to do homework, but instead of studying, she found herself staring out her bedroom window at the street below. The houses on Maple Street were small and modest, but most of them were well maintained and surrounded by neat lawns and flower gardens. The Hartwell house stood out like a sore thumb, with its peeling paint and overgrown yard, a physical manifestation of the dysfunction that festered within its walls. Emma thought about the book Mrs. Patterson had given her, about the women pioneers who'd found the courage to leave everything behind and start over in the wilderness. What would it take for her and her mother to find that kind of courage? What would it take for them to break free from the prison that Robert had built around them? As if summoned by her thoughts, she heard her father's footsteps on the stairs. Again, but tonight they stopped outside her door instead of continuing to her parents' bedroom. Emma's heart hammered in her chest as she heard the soft knock on her door. "Emma, are you awake, sweetheart?" Emma considered pretending to be asleep, but she knew it would only delay the inevitable. "Yes, Dad. I'm doing homework. Can I come in? I want to continue our conversation from earlier." Emma's mouth went dry. "I'm really tired, Dad. Can we talk tomorrow? This will just take a minute." The door opened before Emma could respond, and Robert stepped into her room. In the dim light from her desk lamp, his face was cast in shadows that made him look even more menacing than usual. He closed the door behind him with a soft click that sounded like a death knell. "I've been thinking about what I said earlier," he began, moving to sit on the edge of her bed. "About making it up to you and your mother." Emma remained frozen at her desk, her textbook open in front of her, trying to focus on the words on the page. But the letters seemed to swim before her eyes, and she couldn't concentrate on anything except the sound of her father's breathing. I know you're becoming quite a beautiful young woman," Robert continued, his voice taking on a tone that made Emma's skin crawl. "I bet the boys at school have started to notice you." "I don't really talk to boys," Emma managed to say. "Good. Boys, your age, they only want one thing. They don't understand how to treat a lady with respect." Robert's voice grew closer, and Emma realized he'd moved from the bed to stand behind her chair. A woman needs a man who knows how to take care of her, how to appreciate her. Emma felt his hand come to rest on her shoulder, and every muscle in her body tensed. "Dad, I really need to finish my homework." "Homework can wait." His other hand joined the first, and Emma could feel his thumbs moving in small circles against her shoulders. "I think it's time we had a more adult conversation." Emma shot to her feet so quickly that her chair toppled backward. "I need to check on Mom," she said, backing toward the door, but Robert moved faster than she expected, positioning himself between Emma and the door. "Your mother's fine. She's taking a bath. It's just you and me." Emma's mind raced, searching for any possible escape route. Her bedroom was on the second floor, so the window wasn't an option. The only way out was through the door, and Robert was blocking her path. "Dad, please," she whispered, her voice cracking with terror. "I don't want to have an adult conversation. I'm still a kid." "You're 15 years old, Emma. When I was your age, I was already working to support my family. You're old enough to understand certain things about life." Emma pressed herself against the wall, wishing she could somehow disappear into the faded wallpaper. "I understand plenty about life. I understand that this is wrong." Robert's expression shifted, and Emma saw a flash of the anger that was never far from the surface. "Wrong? What's wrong is the way you and your mother have been treating me lately. What's wrong is the lack of respect in this house. We respect you, Dad. We do everything you ask. Do you?" Robert took a step closer, and Emma could smell the alcohol on his breath. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're being very disrespectful right now." Emma knew she was trapped. Any move she made would only anger him further, but staying still felt like accepting the unacceptable. In that moment, she made a decision that would change everything. She screamed. The sound that erupted from her throat was primal, a cry of pure terror and desperation that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. It was loud enough to wake the dead, and Emma prayed it was loud enough to bring her mother running. Robert's hand flew to cover her mouth, but Emma bit down hard on his palm, tasting blood. He cursed and pulled his hand away, and Emma screamed again, even louder this time. "What the hell is going on up there?" Sarah's voice called from downstairs, followed by the sound of running footsteps. Robert's face contorted with rage, and for a moment Emma thought he might strike her. But the sound of Sarah's approach seemed to bring him back to his senses. He stepped away from Emma, his chest heaving with anger and frustration. "This isn't over," he hissed, just as Sarah burst through the door. "What happened?" Sarah's eyes darted between her husband and daughter, taking in Emma's terrified expression and Robert's defensive posture. "Nothing happened," Robert said, his voice returning to its earlier false gentleness. "Emma had a nightmare. I was just trying to comfort her." Sarah's gaze met Emma's, and in that moment, a silent communication passed between them. Sarah had lived with Robert long enough to recognize the signs of his predatory behavior, and she could see the truth written in her daughter's eyes. "I think Emma needs some rest," Sarah said carefully. "Why don't we let her get some sleep?" Robert looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Sarah's tone must have warned him off. "Of course," he said. "Sweet dreams, Emma." After Robert left, Sarah closed the door and knelt beside Emma, who had collapsed onto her bed in a shaking heap. "Did he hurt you?" Sarah whispered. Emma shook her head, but the tears streaming down her face told a different story. He didn't actually do anything, but he wanted to. I could see it in his eyes." Sarah's face went pale, and Emma saw something change in her mother's expression. The fear was still there, but it was joined by something else, a fierce, protective anger that Emma had never seen before. "Pack a bag," Sarah said quietly. "Just the essentials. We're leaving tonight." Emma stared at her mother in shock. "Leaving? But where will we go?" "I don't know yet, but I know we can't stay here." Sarah stood up, her movements suddenly filled with purpose. "I should have done this years ago. I should have protected you from him." "Mom, he'll find us." "You know he will." Sarah's jaw set in a determined line. "Maybe, but at least we'll have tried. I won't let him touch you, Emma. I won't let him turn you into another victim." As Sarah left to pack her own bag, Emma sat on her bed, staring at the small suitcase her mother had retrieved from the closet. The idea of leaving everything behind was terrifying, but not as terrifying as the thought of staying. She thought again of the book Mrs. Patterson had given her, about the pioneer women who'd found the courage to start over in an unknown wilderness. Maybe it was time for the Hartwell women to become pioneers themselves. Emma began to pack, her hands shaking, as she folded her few decent clothes and gathered her most precious possessions. She didn't know where they were going or how they would survive, but she knew that anything was better than spending another night under the same roof as Robert Hartwell. Downstairs, she could hear the sound of the television and her father's occasional laughter at some late-night comedy show. He had no idea that his wife and daughter were preparing to walk out of his life forever. Emma prayed they would be able to leave before he discovered what they were planning. As she packed, Emma found herself thinking about the future for the first time in years. It was a future filled with uncertainty and danger, but it was also a future filled with possibility. For the first time in her life, she dared to imagine a world where she and her mother could live without fear, where they could build something better from the ashes of their broken family. The clock on her nightstand read 11:47 p.m. when Sarah appeared in her doorway, carrying a small duffel bag and her purse. "Are you ready?" she whispered. Emma nodded, shouldering her backpack and picking up her suitcase. Together, they crept down the stairs, avoiding the creaky boards they'd memorized over the years. The sound of the television masked their movements, and Robert remained oblivious in his recliner, surrounded by empty beer cans. They made it to the kitchen before disaster struck. Emma's suitcase caught on the doorframe, causing her to stumble and knock over a chair. The crash seemed to echo through the house like a gunshot, and both women froze in terror. The television went silent. "Sarah?" Robert's voice called from the living room. "What was that?" Emma and her mother exchanged a look of pure panic. They were so close to freedom, but now everything was falling apart. "I'm just getting a glass of water," Sarah called back, her voice remarkably steady. Footsteps approached the kitchen, and Emma knew their escape attempt was over before it had really begun. Robert appeared in the doorway, his eyes immediately taking in the bags they carried and the guilt written across their faces. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm. The silence that followed was the most terrifying sound Emma had ever heard. She could see the rage building in her father's eyes, a fury that would make all his previous outbursts seem like gentle corrections. This time, she knew he might actually kill them both. But then, just as Robert stepped into the kitchen, a sound from outside made everyone freeze. The rumble of a truck engine pulling into their driveway. The headlights cut through the darkness, like twin beacons of hope, casting long shadows across the kitchen where three people stood frozen in a tableau of fear and impending violence. Robert's face twisted with confusion and anger as he moved toward the window, his heavy footsteps echoing through the tense silence. "Who the hell is that at this hour?" he muttered, peering through the grimy curtains at the unfamiliar pickup truck in their driveway. Emma clutched her mother's hand, both of them still holding their meager belongings, afraid to move or breathe. The truck's engine shut off, and they heard the metallic slam of a door closing. Footsteps approached the front porch, measured, confident steps that belonged to someone unafraid of what they might find. 3 sharp knocks echoed through the house. Robert's eyes darted between his wife and daughter, taking in their packed bags with renewed fury. "Don't either of you move," he hissed, pointing a warning finger at them. "We'll deal with this after I get rid of whoever's at my door." The knocking came again, more insistent this time. Robert straightened his shirt and ran a hand through his disheveled hair, transforming his expression into a mask of irritated innocence. Emma watched this performance with sick fascination. Even now, caught in the act of terrorizing his family, her father was preparing to play the role of the upstanding citizen disturbed by late-night visitors. "Coming!" Robert called out in a voice that suggested mild annoyance rather than the murderous rage that had filled the kitchen moments before. He shot one more threatening look at his wife and daughter before disappearing into the hallway. Emma heard the front door open, followed by her father's artificially friendly voice. "Can I help you?" "Evening, sir. Sorry to bother you so late." The stranger's voice was deep and measured, carrying a slight accent that Emma couldn't quite place. "I'm looking for the Hartwell residence. I believe I may have found it." "That's right. I'm Robert." "Hartwell? What's this about?" There was a pause, and Emma strained to hear the conversation through the thin walls of the old house. Sarah's grip on her hand tightened, and Emma could feel her mother's pulse racing through her palm. "My name is Jake Morrison," the stranger continued. "I'm here about your wife, Sarah." Emma felt her mother stiffen beside her. The name meant nothing to Emma, but she could see recognition dawning in Sarah's eyes, followed by an expression of disbelief and something that might have been hope. "Jake Morrison," Sarah whispered so quietly that Emma almost didn't hear her. "My wife?" Robert's voice carried a dangerous edge now. "What business do you have with my wife?" "I think that's something I should discuss with her directly, if you don't mind." Emma had never heard anyone speak to her father with such calm authority. Most people in Cedar Falls either feared Robert Hartwell or had learned to avoid him entirely. This Jake Morrison seemed to belong to neither category. "Actually, I do mind." Robert's voice was rising now, his artificial politeness beginning to crack. "It's nearly midnight and my family is trying to sleep. Whatever you're selling, we're not interested." "I'm not selling anything, Mr. Hartwell. I'm here because Sarah's sister asked me to check on her." The words hit the kitchen like a thunderbolt. Emma stared at her mother in shock. "You have a sister," she whispered. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded slowly. "I haven't seen her in 15 years. Your father made me cut off all contact with my family when we got married." Emma's mind reeled with this revelation. She had grown up believing that she and her mother had no one in the world except each other and Robert. The idea that there were people out there who cared about them, who had been looking for them, was almost too overwhelming to process. In the hallway, Robert's voice had turned openly hostile. "My wife doesn't have a sister. I don't know what kind of scam you're trying to pull, but you need to get off my property before I call the police." "The police might be a good idea," Jake Morrison replied calmly. "I'd be interested to hear what they have to say about the condition of your wife and daughter." Emma heard her father's sharp intake of breath, followed by a moment of deadly silence. When Robert spoke again, his voice was low and threatening. "I don't know what you think you know about my family, but you're mistaken. My wife and daughter are fine, are they? Then I'm sure you won't mind if I speak with them myself. Get off my property now." "I'm afraid I can't do that, sir. Not until I've spoken with Sarah." Emma heard the sound of Robert's footsteps stomping back toward the kitchen, and she knew their brief reprieve was over. Her father appeared in the doorway, his face flushed with anger and something else, fear. For the first time in Emma's memory, Robert Hartwell looked genuinely afraid. "Sarah," he called, his voice tight with controlled fury, "get out here. There's some lunatic at the door, claiming to know your family." Sarah hesitated, and Emma could see the war playing out in her mother's expression. Hope battled with years of conditioned fear, and for a moment Emma wasn't sure which would win. "Sarah!" Robert's voice carried a clear threat. "Now!" But instead of moving toward her husband, Sarah turned to Emma. "Stay close to me," she whispered. "Whatever happens, don't leave my side." They walked together toward the front door, their packed bags forgotten in the kitchen. Emma could see the stranger through the screen door, a tall man in worn jeans and a denim jacket with dark hair beneath a cowboy hat. His face was weathered by sun and wind, but his eyes were kind. There was something about him that radiated, quiet strength and competence, like someone who had faced difficult situations before and emerged unbroken. "Sarah?" Jake Morrison's voice was gentle now, and Emma saw her mother's composure finally crack. "Jake," Sarah whispered, pressing her hand against the screen door, as if she could reach through it to touch him. "I can't believe you're here." "Your sister's been looking for you for 15 years, Jake said. "She never stopped believing she'd find you." Robert stepped between his wife and the door, his body language aggressive and territorial. "I told you to get off my property. Whatever lies my wife's family has been spreading, they're not lies." Sarah's voice was stronger now, and she stepped around her husband to face Jake directly. "He's been hurting us, both of us." Emma watched her father's face contort with rage at her mother's words. "Sarah, shut your mouth. You don't know what you're saying." But Sarah was looking at Jake Morrison as if he were a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. "My sister. Is she—" "She's alive and well," Jake confirmed. "She's got a ranch in Wyoming now, married a good man, has 3 kids. She's been putting money aside for years, hoping that someday she'd be able to help you start." "Over? That's enough," Robert exploded, lunging toward the door, but Jake Morrison was ready for him. As Robert reached for the door handle, Jake's hand shot out and caught his wrist in a grip that made Robert gasp with pain. "I wouldn't recommend that, sir," Jake said calmly. "Now I can see that your wife and daughter are packed and ready to leave. Seems to me they've already made their decision." Robert tried to pull his wrist free, but Jake's grip didn't budge. Emma had never seen her father look so helpless, and the sight filled her with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. "You have no right," Robert began, but Jake cut him off. "I have every right to help a woman and her child escape an abusive situation. And from what I can see through this door, that's exactly what this is." Emma looked at her mother and saw tears streaming down Sarah's face. But they weren't tears of fear or despair. They were tears of relief, of hope, of 15 years of buried emotion finally finding release. "We can't," Sarah whispered. "He'll find us. He'll make us come back." "No, he won't," Jake said firmly. "Your sister's got connections in law enforcement now. Her husband's a county sheriff in Wyoming. We've got safe places where you can go, legal protection, everything you need to start fresh." Wyoming, Emma breathed. The words sounded like a promise, like the answer to prayers she hadn't even known she was praying. Robert's struggle to free himself from Jake's grip was becoming more desperate. "Let go of me. This is kidnapping. You can't just take my family." "I'm not taking anyone," Jake replied. "I'm offering them a choice, something they haven't had in a long time from the looks of things." Sarah looked at her daughter, and Emma saw the question in her mother's eyes. It was the biggest decision of their lives, and Sarah was asking Emma to help make it. Emma thought about the book Mrs. Patterson had given her, about the pioneer women who had risked everything for the chance at a better life. She thought about the terror she'd felt in her bedroom earlier that evening, about the years of violence and fear that stretched behind them, and about the hope that now flickered before them like a candle in the darkness. "I want to go," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper, then stronger. "I want to go with him." Sarah's face crumpled with relief and gratitude. "Get our bags," she told Emma. "Quickly." Emma raced back to the kitchen, her heart hammering with excitement and terror. She grabbed their bags and returned to find Jake Morrison still holding her father immobilized, while Sarah stood behind the screen door, her hand on the latch. "If you leave me," Robert snarled at his wife, "you'll have nothing. No money, no home, nowhere to go. You'll come crawling back within a week." Sarah's hand trembled on the door latch, and for a moment Emma was afraid her mother's courage would fail. But then Sarah looked at Emma, at the bags in her daughter's hands, at the bruises that makeup couldn't quite hide, and her jaw set with determination. "I'd rather have nothing than live with you for one more day," she said, and opened the door. The next few minutes passed in a blur of motion and desperate energy. Jake released Robert's wrist and stepped back, positioning himself between the man and his fleeing family. Sarah and Emma rushed to the pickup truck, throwing their bags into the bed and climbing into the cab with shaking hands. Robert followed them out onto the porch, shouting threats and curses that echoed through the quiet neighborhood. "You'll regret this, Sarah. Both of you. I'll find you wherever you go. You belong to me." Jake climbed into the driver's seat with calm efficiency, started the engine, and backed out of the driveway while Robert continued his tirade from the porch. Emma looked back at the house on Maple Street, the only home she'd ever known, and felt no sadness, only relief. As they drove through the sleeping streets of Cedar Falls, Sarah began to sob, great, shuddering sobs that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul. Emma put her arms around her mother, and they held each other while Jake drove in respectful silence, giving them space to process the enormity of what had just happened. "Thank you," Sarah finally managed to say through her tears. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me," Jake replied. "Your sister's the one who deserves the thanks. She spent 15 years putting together the resources to make this possible. She never gave up on finding you." Emma found her voice. "What's her name?" "My aunt." Rebecca Thomas now. She goes by Becca. Emma tested the name in her mind. Aunt Becca. Families she'd never known existed, people who had cared about them from afar, who had been working to save them even when salvation seemed impossible. They drove through the night, leaving Cedar Falls behind them as they headed toward the interstate. Jake explained that they would drive to Denver first, where they would meet Rebecca and her husband. From there, they would all travel together to the ranch in Wyoming, where Sarah and Emma could begin to heal and plan their new lives. "What about school?" Emma asked suddenly, the practical realities of their escape beginning to hit her. "There's a good school in Sweetwater," Jake assured her. "Small town, good people. You'll finish your education there if you want to." "I want to," Emma said firmly. Education was still her path to independence, her insurance against ever being trapped again. As the miles rolled by, Jake told them about Rebecca's life in Wyoming. She had married a man named David Thomas, a rancher and part-time sheriff who had helped her search for her missing sister. They had 3 children, Emma's cousins, whose names she learned for the first time. Michael, 16, Jessica, 14, and little Sam, 8 years old. "Rebecca owns a small bakery in town," Jake continued. "She's done well for herself, built a good life, but she's always said it would never be complete until she found you." Sarah wiped her eyes with the tissue Jake had handed her from the glove compartment. "I wanted to contact her so many times over the years, but Robert, he said if I ever tried to reach out to my family, he would make sure I never saw Emma again. He said he would take her somewhere I could never find her." "He can't hurt you anymore," Jake said simply. "By tomorrow night, you'll be under the protection of a county sheriff and surrounded by people who care about you." Emma stared out the window at the dark landscape rushing past. Mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks barely visible against the star-filled sky. She had never been outside of Montana, never traveled more than 50 miles from Cedar Falls. Everything ahead of them was unknown territory, but for the first time in her life, the unknown didn't frighten her. "Jake," she said suddenly, "how do you fit into all this? Are you a relative too?" Jake glanced at her in the rearview mirror, and Emma caught a glimpse of his smile. "I'm Rebecca's neighbor. Got a small ranch next to theirs. She asked me to come, find you, because she knew I'd have the best chance of convincing you to trust me." "Why would she think that?" "Because I've been where you are," Jake said quietly. "Different circumstances, but I know what it's like to feel trapped, to think there's no way out. Sometimes it takes an outsider to show you that there are other possibilities." Emma sensed there was more to Jake's story, but she didn't press. The night was full of revelations, and she was still processing the fact that she had a family she'd never known about, that there were people in the world who had been fighting for her freedom even when she didn't know they existed. They stopped for gas in a small town whose name Emma didn't catch, and Jake bought them coffee and sandwiches from a 24-hour diner. As they sat in a booth, eating their late-night meal, Emma studied the man who had appeared at their door like an answer to prayer. Jake Morrison looked to be in his early 40s, with the weathered hands and sun-lined face of someone who worked outdoors. His clothes were clean but worn, practical rather than fashionable. There was something solid and dependable about him, a quality that reminded Emma of the cowboys in the books she'd read about the Old West. "What's Wyoming like?" Emma asked. "Big," Jake replied with a smile. "Lots of open space, clean air, room to breathe. The kind of place where people mind their own business but help their neighbors when they need it." Sarah had been quiet during their meal, lost in thought. Now she looked up at Jake with an expression of curiosity mixed with gratitude. "Why did you agree to help us? You don't even know us." Jake considered the question for a moment before answering. "Rebecca's been a good neighbor to me. When I needed help a few years back, she was there without question. Besides," he paused, his expression growing serious, "I've seen what men like your husband can do to families. Nobody should have to live in fear in their own home." They finished their meal, and returned to the truck, driving deeper into the night toward an uncertain but hopeful future. Emma dozed fitfully against her mother's shoulder, her dreams filled with visions of wide-open spaces and skies that stretched to infinity. When she woke, the sun was rising over the Colorado plains, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber. They were driving through country unlike anything Emma had ever seen. Endless grasslands dotted with cattle, distant mountains rising like purple monuments against the sky. "Almost to Denver," Jake announced. "Rebecca and David are meeting us at a hotel near the airport. We'll rest for a few hours, then make the final drive to Wyoming." Emma felt her stomach flutter with nervous anticipation. In a few hours, she would meet the aunt she'd never known, the cousins who were strangers, the extended family that had been stolen from her by her father's jealousy and control. "What if they don't like me?" she asked suddenly. Sarah stroked her daughter's hair. "They're going to love you," she said with quiet confidence. "How could they not?" As they entered the outskirts of Denver, Emma saw the city spreading out before them like a promise of all the possibilities that lay ahead. Somewhere in that urban landscape, her Aunt Rebecca was waiting, the sister who had never stopped searching, never stopped hoping, never stopped believing that this day would come. The hotel Jake had chosen was modest but clean, and he had reserved 2 adjoining rooms for them to rest and clean up before the reunion. Emma showered off the fear and desperation of the previous night, watching the water carry away the dust of Cedar Falls and the residue of her old life. When she emerged from the bathroom, she found her mother sitting on the bed, staring at her. Reflection in the mirror across the room. Sarah had also showered and changed clothes, but the bruises on her face were still visible, purple and yellow reminders of the violence they had escaped. "What if she doesn't recognize me?" Sarah asked. "It's been 15 years. I'm not the same person I was when I left home." Emma sat beside her mother on the bed. "She'll recognize you," she said with the certainty of youth. "You're her sister. Family doesn't forget family." A knock on the door made them both jump. "It's Jake," came the familiar voice from the hallway. "Are you ready? They're here." Emma's heart began to race as they walked down the hotel corridor toward the lobby. With each step, she felt the weight of her old life falling away and the promise of her new life growing stronger. By tonight, she would be in Wyoming, surrounded by family she'd never known existed, beginning a chapter of her story that would be written in hope instead of fear. As they rounded the corner into the lobby, Emma saw a woman with auburn hair like her mother's standing near the front desk. The woman turned, and Emma knew immediately that she was looking at her Aunt Rebecca. The family resemblance was unmistakable. The same green eyes, the same determination set to the jaw, the same strength that had allowed Sarah to survive 15 years of abuse and finally find the courage to escape. "Sarah!" Rebecca whispered, and then the 2 sisters were running toward each other across the hotel lobby, 15 years of separation dissolving in an embrace that seemed to heal old wounds and promise new beginnings. Emma stood frozen, watching. Her mother cried tears of joy for the first time in her memory, and she knew that their long journey toward freedom had finally begun. The Wyoming landscape stretched endlessly before them as they created the final hill leading into Sweetwater Valley. Emma pressed her face against the passenger window of David Thomas's SUV, drinking in the sight of rolling pastures dotted with cattle and horses, all framed by mountains that seemed to touch the sky itself. After the cramped confines of Cedar Falls, the sheer vastness of this place felt like stepping into another world. "There it is," Rebecca said from the front seat, pointing toward a cluster of buildings nestled in the valley below. "The Thomas Ranch. Your new home." Emma felt her mother's hand squeeze hers as they took in their first glimpse of the ranch. The main house was a sprawling log structure with a wraparound porch that looked like something from a Western movie. Outbuildings were scattered across the property, barns, stables, and what looked like a bunkhouse. Horses grazed peacefully in the nearest pasture, their coats gleaming in the afternoon sun. David Thomas, Rebecca's husband, caught Emma's expression in the rearview mirror and smiled. He was a man of few words but obvious kindness, with greying hair and laugh lines around his eyes that spoke of a life lived outdoors. "Wait until you see the sunset from the back porch," he said. "Best view in 3 counties." The 3 days they'd spent in Denver had been a whirlwind of emotions and arrangements. Rebecca had immediately taken Sarah to a doctor who documented her injuries for potential legal proceedings against Robert. Meanwhile, Emma had spent time getting to know her aunt and uncle, slowly beginning to understand what a normal family dynamic looked like. Rebecca was everything Emma had imagined an aunt might be: warm, protective, and fiercely loyal. She owned a successful bakery in Sweetwater and had used the profits over the years to build a fund specifically for Sarah's rescue. David was a quiet counterpoint to his wife's energy, a man who spoke little but conveyed volumes through his actions and the respect others showed him. As they pulled into the ranch's circular driveway, 3 figures emerged from the house. Emma's cousins, Michael, Jessica, and Sam, arranged themselves on the porch steps like a welcoming committee. Michael was tall and lanky at 16, with his father's serious demeanor but his mother's green eyes. Jessica had Rebecca's auburn hair and looked to be close to Emma's own age. 8-year-old Sam bounced on his toes with barely contained excitement, his face split by a gap-toothed grin. "Welcome home," Rebecca said softly as David parked the SUV. Home. The word felt foreign on Emma's tongue, but as she climbed out of the vehicle and breathed the clean mountain air, she began to understand what it might mean. This wasn't just a place to hide from Robert. It was a place where they could build something new. Sam was the first to break the ice, bounding down from the porch with characteristic 8-year-old enthusiasm. "Are you really my cousin?" he asked Emma directly. "Mom said you might know how to ride horses, but I don't believe her because you're from the city." "Sam," Jessica chided, but Emma found herself laughing, actually laughing, for the first time in weeks. "I've never ridden a horse in my life," Emma admitted, "but I'd like to learn." "I can teach you," Sam declared. "I've been riding since I was 5. Dad says I'm a natural." Michael stepped forward and extended his hand to Emma with surprising formality. "I'm Michael. Mum's told us a lot about you and Aunt Sarah. We're glad you're here." There was something in his tone that suggested he understood more about their situation than his younger siblings. Emma shook his hand, appreciating that he was treating her like an adult rather than a victim to be pitied. Jessica hung back slightly, her expression shy but curious. "I cleaned out half my closet for you," she said quietly. "Mom said you might not have brought many clothes." Emma felt tears prick her eyes at this simple act of generosity. "Thank you, that's really thoughtful." "Girls your age grow so fast," Rebecca said, appearing at Emma's elbow with a gentle smile. "We'll go shopping in Cheyenne next week, get you properly outfitted for ranch life." The tour of the house revealed a world of comfort Emma had never imagined. The rooms were spacious and filled with natural light, decorated with a mix of Western, antiques and comfortable modern furniture. Family photos covered the walls, pictures of the Thomas children at various ages, of Rebecca and David on their wedding day, of ranch life through the seasons. Emma's room was on the 2nd floor, with windows that looked out over the horse pastures toward the mountains. Jessica had indeed cleared half her closet, and the dresser was stocked with basic necessities that Rebecca had purchased during their Denver stopover. A comfortable bed with a handmade quilt dominated the space, and a bookshelf in the corner was already filled with novels that looked well read and loved. "The bathroom's across the hall," Jessica explained. "We share it, but I'm usually up early for chores, so you'll have it to yourself most mornings." Chores. Emma realized she had no idea what would be expected of her here. In Cedar Falls, her responsibilities had been limited to homework and staying out of her father's way. What kind of chores do you do? Feeding the horses mostly, collecting eggs from the chickens, helping Mom with the garden. Nothing too hard. Dad says work is good for the soul, but he doesn't believe in child labor. That evening, the extended family gathered around the dining room table for what Rebecca called a proper welcome dinner. The table was laden with homemade bread, roast beef, mashed potatoes, and vegetables from the ranch's garden. Emma couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten a meal that hadn't been prepared under the shadow of Robert's potential anger. The conversation flowed easily around the table, touching on ranch business, the children's school activities, and Rebecca's bakery. No one pressed Sarah or Emma for details about their past, but the family's questions about their interests and plans for the future made it clear they were welcome here permanently. "Emma, Rebecca tells me you're a strong student," David said as they dug into Rebecca's apple pie for dessert. "Sweetwater High is small, but they've got good teachers. My friend Tom Bradley is the principal. I already called him about getting you enrolled." "I'd like that," Emma said. "I was worried about missing too much school." "Education's important," David agreed, "but so is healing. You take the time you need to settle in before you worry about catching up on anything academic." After dinner, Jake Morrison appeared at the kitchen door, hat in hand. Emma had wondered when she would see him again. He'd been quiet during their Denver stay, maintaining a respectful distance while the family reunited, but never straying far in case he was needed. "Evening, folks," he said, accepting Rebecca's invitation to come in for coffee. "Thought I'd check on how everyone's settling in." "Jake's ranch borders ours to the east," David explained to Sarah and Emma. "He's been instrumental in helping us prepare for your arrival." Emma studied Jake as he accepted a cup of coffee from Rebecca. In the warm kitchen light, she could see the kindness in his weathered features more clearly. There were questions she wanted to ask him, about his own past, about how he'd known exactly what to say to convince them to trust him that night in Cedar Falls. But something in his demeanor suggested he was a man who revealed himself slowly, in his own time. "How are you finding ranch life so far?" Jake asked Emma directly. "It's different," Emma admitted. "Quieter than I expected, but in a good way." "Takes some getting used to if you're from town," Jake agreed. "But there's something to be said for being able to hear yourself think." "Jake's being modest," Rebecca interjected. "He's got one of the best horse operations in the county. Emma, if you're serious about learning to ride, Jake's your man." Emma felt a flutter of nervousness mixed with excitement. "I'd like that, if you don't mind teaching a complete beginner." "Everyone starts somewhere," Jake said simply. "If you're interested, come by tomorrow afternoon. We'll start with the basics." After Jake left, the family began their evening routines. Emma helped Jessica clear the table, while Sarah assisted Rebecca with the dishes. The domestic normalcy of it all felt surreal after years of walking on eggshells around Robert's volatile moods. As Emma prepared for bed in her new room, she found herself standing at the window, staring out at the star-filled sky. She'd never seen so many stars in her life. The absence of city lights revealed the full majesty of the night sky in ways that took her breath away. A soft knock on her door interrupted her stargazing. "Come in," she called, expecting to see Jessica or her mother. Instead, Rebecca peeked around the door. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I wanted to check on how you're feeling about everything." Emma gestured to the chair beside the window, and Rebecca settled into it with the easy grace of someone comfortable in her own home. "It's overwhelming," Emma admitted. "Good. Overwhelming, but still overwhelming." "I can imagine. You've been through more changes in the past week than most people experience in years." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both looking out at the starlit landscape. Finally, Rebecca spoke again. "I want you to know that you're not A burden here, Emma. Your family. This is your home for as long as you want it to be. Even if we never go back to Montana, even if we can't contribute financially. Rebecca's laugh was gentle but firm. Honey, this ranch has been profitable for 20 years. Your mother's already talking about helping out at the bakery, and David's mentioned that you might be interested in working with the horses eventually. But even if neither of you ever worked a day, you'd still be welcome here. That's what family means. Emma felt tears threaten again. I'm not used to people being kind without expecting something in return. Then you've been around the wrong people, Rebecca said simply. Your mother raised you to be strong and resilient, but strength doesn't mean you have to face everything alone. You've got a whole family now who wants to see you succeed. The next morning, Emma woke to the sound of roosters crowing and the distant lowing of cattle. Sunlight streamed through her windows, revealing the Wyoming landscape in all its morning glory. She dressed quickly in jeans and a t-shirt that Jessica had lent her and made her way downstairs. The kitchen was already bustling with activity. Rebecca was packing lunches for the school-aged children, while Sarah helped prepare breakfast. David sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the local newspaper, occasionally commenting on items of interest to the family. "Sleep well?" Sarah asked, looking up from the eggs she was scrambling. "Better than I have in years," Emma replied honestly. The absence of fear was still a strange sensation, but one she was beginning to appreciate. "Michael and Jessica are heading to school in about 20 minutes, Rebecca said. "Would you like to ride along and see the town? It might help you feel more prepared for when you start classes." Emma nodded eagerly. Sweetwater was only about 10 miles from the ranch, but it represented her first real glimpse of the community that would become her new home. The drive to town took them through more beautiful rangeland before arriving at a cluster of buildings that constituted downtown Sweetwater. The town was small but well-maintained, with a main street lined with local businesses and tree-shaded residential neighborhoods spreading out from the commercial center. "There's Mom's bakery," Jessica pointed out as they passed a cheerful storefront, with Rebecca's Rise painted on the window. "She makes the best cinnamon rolls in 3 counties. The high school was a modern brick building surrounded by well-kept athletic fields. Emma could see students arriving for the day, and while the sight of teenagers made her nervous, she was encouraged by how relaxed and friendly they seemed compared to the sometimes hostile atmosphere of her old school. "Most of these kids have known each other since kindergarten," Michael explained, seeming to sense her apprehension. "But they're good people. They'll give you a chance to fit in." After dropping off Michael and Jessica, Rebecca drove Emma through the rest of the town, pointing out the library, the medical clinic, the sheriff's office where David worked part-time, and the various shops and services that kept the community functioning. "It's not a big place," Rebecca admitted as they headed back toward the ranch, "but it's a good place. People look out for each other here." Emma thought about this as they drove through the open countryside. In Cedar Falls, the Hartwell family's situation had been an open secret that everyone chose to ignore. Here she sensed such willful blindness would be less likely to occur. That afternoon, Emma made her way to Jake Morrison's ranch for her first riding lesson. His property was smaller than the Thomas spread, but equally well maintained. The barn was painted red with white trim, and several horses grazed in the adjacent pasture. Jake emerged from the barn as she approached, leading a gentle-looking mare with a glossy brown coat. "This is Honey," he said by way of introduction. "She's 20 years old and has taught more beginning riders than any horse in the county. She's patient with mistakes and won't let you get hurt." The next hour was both terrifying and exhilarating, as Jake taught Emma the basics of horse care and riding. Honey lived up to her reputation, standing patiently, while Emma learned to saddle her and responding to Emma's hesitant commands with gentle obedience. "You're a natural," Jake said, as Emma successfully guided Honey through a series of simple maneuvers. Most first-time riders are much more tense. I think I'm too nervous to be tense, Emma replied, patting Honey's neck with growing confidence. As they cooled down the horse after the lesson, Jake began to open up about his own background. He'd grown up in Texas, he told her, on a ranch, not unlike this one. But his father had been an alcoholic with a violent temper, and Jake had left home at 17 to escape a situation that sounded disturbingly familiar to Emma. Took me years to realize that not all families operate on fear and control, he said, as they led Honey back to the pasture. Finding good people like the Thomases made all the difference. Is that why you helped us? Emma asked. Because you understood what we were going through. Jake considered the question as he latched the pasture gate. Partly, but mostly I helped because Rebecca asked me to, and I've never known her to ask for help unless it was truly needed. As Emma walked back to the Thomas ranch that evening, she reflected on how much her life had changed in just a few days. The constant anxiety that had been her companion for years was slowly beginning to fade, replaced by something she was almost afraid to name: hope. The ranch house was warm and welcoming as she approached, light spilling from the windows and the sound of laughter drifting from the kitchen. This was what a real home looked like, she realized. Not a place where people walked on eggshells and counted the minutes until the next explosion of violence, but a place where families gathered to share their days and plan their tomorrows. For the first time since leaving Cedar Falls, Emma allowed herself to believe that she and her mother had truly escaped. They weren't just running anymore, they were building something new. And maybe, just maybe, they were finally safe. 3 weeks into their new life in Wyoming, Emma was beginning to believe that nightmares were a thing of the past. She'd settled into a routine that felt almost normal. Morning chores with Jessica, afternoon riding lessons with Jake, evenings helping her mother at Rebecca's bakery. The bruises on Sarah's face had faded to yellow-green shadows, and for the first time in years, both mother and daughter were sleeping through the night. That peace shattered at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning when David's cell phone rang with the distinctive tone he'd programmed for official sheriff's business. Emma was in the kitchen, helping Rebecca prepare breakfast, when David answered the call in his gruff, professional voice. "Sheriff Thomas!" The one-sided conversation that followed made Emma's blood run cold. "When did this happen?" David asked, his expression growing increasingly grim. "How did he get the information?" A pause. "I see. And you're certain it was him?" Emma's hands began to shake as she set down the plate she'd been holding. Across the kitchen, she saw her mother freeze at the stove, spatula suspended mid-flip over the pancakes. "We'll take all necessary precautions," David continued. "Yes, I understand the jurisdiction issues, but this is my family now." Another pause. "Keep me informed of any developments." He ended the call and stood in the sudden silence of the kitchen, his face grave. Rebecca, Sarah, and Emma all stared at him, afraid to voice the question they all knew was coming. "That was Sheriff Martinez in Cedar Falls," David said finally. "Robert Hartwell was arrested last night for assault and public intoxication. He's claiming his wife and daughter were kidnapped and taken to Wyoming." Emma felt the familiar knot of terror form in her stomach. "Does he know where we are?" "Not specifically, but he mentioned Sweetwater by name during his arrest. Seems he's been making inquiries, probably hired someone to trace your movements." David's jaw tightened. "He's been telling anyone who will listen that Jake Morrison kidnapped his family." Sarah sank into the nearest chair, her face pale. "He'll never let us go. I knew this would happen." "Hey," Rebecca said firmly, moving to her sister's side. "We're not the same helpless women who lived in fear 3 weeks ago. We have resources now, legal protection, people who will stand with us." David nodded his agreement. "Martinez says Robert's been drinking heavily since you left, lost his job at the auto shop, behind on the house payments. He's desperate, which Makes him dangerous, but it also makes him careless. Emma found her voice. What does this mean for us? Do we have to leave again? No, David said with quiet authority. This is your home, and we protect our own here. But we need to be smart about this. No more riding alone to Jake's place, no unsupervised trips to town. Until we know more about Robert's planning, we treat this as a credible threat. The next few days passed in a state of heightened alert that felt sickeningly familiar to Emma. The easy freedom she'd begun to take for granted was replaced by constant vigilance. David arranged for deputy patrols to increase their presence around both the Thomas and Morrison ranches, and Jake began spending more time at the main house, his presence both comforting and ominous. Emma's riding lessons moved from Jake's ranch to the Thomas property, conducted in the pasture closest to the house where multiple people could keep watch. The change felt like a step backward, a return to the prison of fear they'd thought they'd escaped. I hate this, Emma confided to Jessica. As they fed the horses one evening, I hate that he can still control our lives, even from hundreds of miles away. Jessica, who had proven to be wise beyond her 14 years, considered this carefully. Maybe the real question is whether you're going to let him control your life. Fear is a choice, Emma. So is courage. The words stung because they carried the truth. Emma realized she'd been waiting for someone else, David, Jake, Rebecca, to make her feel safe again. But safety, real safety, had to come from within. That realization crystallized into action 2 days later when Tom Bradley, the high school principal, called to discuss Emma's enrollment. David had been putting off the conversation, citing security concerns, but Emma made the decision herself. I want to start school Monday, she announced at dinner. I can't hide on this ranch forever. Emma, Sarah began, her voice tight with worry. Maybe we should wait until what? Until Dad gives up and goes away. We both know that's never going to happen. Emma looked around the table at the faces that had become so dear to her. I won't let him steal any more of my life. I've already lost 15 years to his anger. I won't lose the next 15 to his threats. David studied her for a long moment. You're sure about this? I'm sure. Then we make it work. I'll coordinate with the school, make sure they understand the situation. You won't be walking into this blind or unprotected. Jake, who had been quietly eating his dinner, looked up. I've got an idea that might help. My neighbor's daughter, Katie Walsh, is a senior at Sweetwater High. Good kid, smart, knows how to handle herself. I could ask her to keep an eye on Emma, help her navigate the social side of things. I don't need a babysitter, Emma said quickly. Not a babysitter, Jake clarified. A friend. Someone who understands the situation and can help you spot trouble before it finds you. Emma's first day at Sweetwater High arrived with the crisp clarity of early autumn. The aspen trees were beginning to turn gold on the mountainsides, and the morning air carried the promise of winter still months away. Emma, dressed carefully in jeans and a sweater Jessica had helped her pick out, trying to strike a balance between fitting in and feeling like herself. David drove her to school in his sheriff's vehicle, a decision that felt both protective and potentially embarrassing. You sure you want to arrive in a police car? He asked as they pulled into the student parking lot. Might as well establish from day one that I'm not someone to mess with, Emma replied, surprised by her own boldness. Katie Walsh was waiting for them in the principal's office, just as Jake had promised. She was a tall, athletic girl with short blonde hair and an easy smile that immediately put Emma at ease. Her handshake was firm, her manner direct but friendly. Jake's told me a little about your situation, Katie said as David completed the enrollment paperwork. Nothing specific, just that you might need someone to show you the ropes. I've got most of the same classes as you, so we can stick together until you get your bearings. Principal Bradley, a thin man with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, reviewed Emma's transcript from Cedar Falls with approval. Your grades are excellent. I think you'll find our academic standards here quite challenging, but manageable. And for a student of your caliber, the morning classes passed in a blur of introductions, syllabi, and the peculiar social dynamics of small-town high school life. Emma was struck by how different the atmosphere was from her old school. Teachers actually seemed to care about their students' success, and the students themselves were more focused on learning than on establishing social hierarchies through cruelty. At lunch, Katie introduced Emma to her circle of friends, a diverse group that included aspiring ranchers, future college students, and kids who were still figuring out their paths. They welcomed Emma with the casual friendliness that seemed to characterize Sweetwater in general. "So you're from Montana?" asked a boy named Tyler, who Katie had identified as the star of the school's rodeo team. "What brings you to our little corner of Wyoming?" Emma had prepared for this question, crafting a response that was truthful without being complete. "My mom and I needed a fresh start. My aunt lives here, so we decided to give ranch life a try." "You picked a good place for it," said a girl named Maria, whose family owned one of the larger areas in the county. "This valley's got some of the best grazing land in the state." The conversation flowed easily from there, touching on everything from upcoming football games to college application deadlines. Emma found herself relaxing for the first time since David's phone call about Robert's arrest. Maybe she really could build a normal life here. That illusion shattered during her last class of the day. Emma was taking notes during advanced English when the classroom door opened and Principal Bradley stepped inside, followed by a man in a sheriff's deputy uniform. The deputy's expression was serious, and his eyes found Emma immediately. "Miss Hartwell," Principal Bradley said quietly, "could you come with us, please?" Emma's heart hammered as she gathered her books, acutely aware of every eye in the classroom following her movements. Katie shot her a look of concern, but stayed in her seat, understanding instinctively that this wasn't the time for questions. The hallway outside the classroom felt like a gauntlet as Emma walked between the two men toward the principal's office. Students turned to stare, and Emma could practically hear the whispered speculations beginning behind her. In the office, David was waiting with his cell phone in hand, and an expression that made Emma's stomach drop to her shoes. "What's happened?" she asked immediately. "Robert's missing," David said without preamble. "He was released on bail yesterday morning and disappeared sometime last night. His landlord found his apartment empty, no forwarding address." The deputy, who introduced himself as Officer Martinez, pulled out a small notebook. "We have reason to believe he's heading west. His truck was spotted at a gas station in Nebraska yesterday afternoon." Emma felt the walls of the principal's office closing in around her. "He's coming here." "We don't know that for certain," David said, but his tone suggested he believed it was likely. "But we're not taking any chances. I'm taking you home now, and we're implementing full security protocols until further notice." The drive back to the ranch passed in tense silence. Emma stared out the window at the beautiful Wyoming landscape and wondered if she would ever again be able to enjoy its beauty without looking over her shoulder for threats. At the ranch, they found the family in crisis mode. Rebecca was pacing the kitchen, while Sarah sat at the table with her head in her hands. Jake was there too, along with two other men Emma didn't recognize, neighbors, she gathered, who had come to offer support and assistance. "How did he get out so fast?" Sarah asked when she saw Emma and David. "I thought you said he'd be held for at least a week." "His brother posted bail," David explained grimly. "Apparently Robert's been playing the victim, claiming you were brainwashed into leaving him. Some people are buying the story." One of the neighbors, a weathered man named Bill Stevens, spoke up. We've got eyes on all the roads leading into the valley. If he shows up here, we'll know about it." Emma appreciated the community support, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were preparing for a siege. What if he doesn't come here directly? What if he's smarter than we're giving him credit for? Jake nodded approvingly at her question. That's exactly the right thing to be thinking. Your father's desperate, but that doesn't necessarily make him stupid. We need to prepare for multiple scenarios. They spent the next hour discussing security arrangements that felt surreal in their intensity. Motion sensors around the property perimeter, check-in protocols for anyone leaving the ranch, a communication system between Thomas and Morrison spreads, emergency plans for different types of threats. Emma listened to it all with growing frustration. This wasn't the life she wanted, a life defined by her father's capacity for violence and control. But she also understood that wishing for a different reality wouldn't make Robert disappear. That evening, as the family tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy over dinner, Emma made another decision that surprised everyone, including herself. "I want to learn to use a gun," she announced into the relative quiet of the dining room. The statement hung in the air like a challenge. Michael and Jessica stopped eating, their forks suspended midway to their mouths. Sam, too young to fully understand the implications, continued working on his mashed potatoes with 8-year-old focus. "Emma," Sarah said carefully, "I don't think that's necessary." "It is necessary," Emma interrupted, her voice stronger than she felt. "I've spent my whole life being afraid of him, running from him, depending on other people to protect me from him. I'm done with that." David set down his coffee cup and studied Emma's face. "Learning to use a firearm is a serious responsibility. It's not something you do out of anger or fear." "I'm not doing it out of anger or fear," Emma replied. "I'm doing it out of determination. I want to be able to protect myself and my family if it comes to that." Jake had been quiet during this exchange, but now he leaned forward. "If you're serious about this, I can teach you. But David's right, it's not a decision to make lightly. Once you learn to use a weapon, you carry the responsibility of that knowledge for the rest of your life." "I understand that." Rebecca looked between her husband and Jake, then at her sister and niece. "Maybe it's not such a bad idea. Sarah, what do you think?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and Emma could see the internal struggle playing out on her mother's face. Finally, she nodded slowly. "If Emma wants to learn, I want to learn too. I never want to feel that helpless again." And so it was decided. The next morning, while the rest of the family went about their normal routines under the watchful eyes of rotating neighbors, Emma and Sarah began their education in self-defense. Jake proved to be a patient and thorough instructor. He started with gun safety basics, drilling into them the fundamental rules that would keep them from accidentally hurting themselves or others. Then came the mechanics, how to load, unload, clean, and store a weapon properly. "A gun is a tool," Jake explained, as Emma held her first pistol with shaking hands. "It's no different from a hammer or a wrench, except that this tool can save your life if you know how to use it properly." The weight of the weapon felt strange in Emma's hands, heavier than she'd expected, but also somehow comforting. This was power, real power, not the kind that came from intimidation and fear, but the kind that came from knowledge and preparation. After 2 hours of instruction, Emma felt more confident but not cocky. She understood now why Jake had emphasized the responsibility that came with this knowledge. The ability to defend herself also carried the burden of potentially having to make life and death decisions. As they walked back to the house, Sarah linked her arm through Emma's. "How do you feel?" "Different," Emma admitted. "More substantial, I guess, like I take up more space in the world." "I know what you mean. For the first time since we left Cedar Falls, I feel like we might actually be able to handle whatever comes next. That afternoon brought news that tested their newfound confidence. David returned from town with an update from law enforcement contacts across the region. Robert's truck had been spotted in Colorado, still heading west. More ominously, he'd been asking questions about Jake Morrison at gas stations and truck stops, apparently convinced that Jake was the key to finding his missing family. "He's closing in," David said grimly. "Maybe not today or tomorrow, but soon. We need to be ready." Emma looked around at the faces of the people who had become her family. David's determined resolve, Rebecca's protective fierceness, Jake's quiet competence, even young Sam's innocent trust that the adults would handle whatever came. She thought about her first day at Sweetwater High, about the friends she was just beginning to make, about the future she was finally allowing herself to envision. Robert Hartwell had taken 15 years of her life. She wouldn't let him take. "One more day, let him come," Emma said quietly. "We'll be ready for him." As if summoned by her words, the phone rang in the kitchen. David answered it with his usual professional greeting, but his expression changed quickly to one of alert concern. "When?" he asked. "How long ago?" A pause. "We'll take all necessary precautions. Thank you for the heads up." He hung up and turned to face the assembled group. "That was the sheriff in Laramie. Robert Hartwell checked into a motel there 2 hours ago. He's less than 100 miles away." The siege was about to begin. The motel clerk in Laramie remembered. Robert Hartwell clearly, not because he was particularly memorable, but because of the questions he'd asked. According to Sheriff Morrison's contact at the Laramie County Sheriff's Office, Robert had spent 20 minutes grilling the desk clerk about local ranches, specifically asking about any operations run by families named Thomas or Morrison. "He's not trying to hide anymore," David observed as he briefed the assembled group in the Thomas family living room. "He's past the point of caring about subtlety." Emma sat between her mother and Jessica on the couch, processing this information with the new clarity that had come with her firearms training. 3 days had passed since Jake had taught her to shoot, and in that time, her entire perspective on the situation had shifted. She was no longer just a victim waiting to be rescued. She was a participant in her own protection. "What's his next logical move?" Emma asked, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. Jake, who had been studying a map of the county spread across the coffee table, looked up with approval. "Smart question. If I were in his position, I'd start with the businesses. In town, Sweetwater's small enough that everyone knows everyone else's business. Rebecca's bakery," Sarah said immediately, her face paling. "He'll start there. Everyone in town knows I've been helping out." Rebecca nodded grimly. "I've already thought of that. Tom Valdez is covering for me starting tomorrow. He's got experience running a kitchen, and more importantly, he's got experience dealing with difficult customers." Tom Valdez was Rebecca's brother-in-law, a former Marine who now worked as a hunting guide during the seasons. Emma had met him briefly and had been impressed by his quiet competence and obvious protective instincts. "What about the school?" Michael asked. "If this guy's really desperate, he might try to grab Emma there." "No school until this is resolved," David said firmly. "I know that's not what you want to hear, Emma, but actually it might be exactly what he's expecting," Emma interrupted. "Think about it. If I were him, I'd assume you'd pull me out of school the moment you knew I was in the area. Maybe the smart move is to keep me in school, but with better protection." David and Jake exchanged a look that Emma was learning to recognize, the expression of adults realizing that a young person had made a valid tactical point. "Explain your thinking," Jake said. Emma stood up and moved to the map, studying the layout of Sweetwater and the surrounding ranches. "He knows we're here, but he doesn't know exactly where. If I disappear from school, it confirms that we're aware of his presence and taking precautions. If I keep going to school, it might make him think we don't know he's coming. It's risky, David said slowly. Everything's risky now, Emma replied, but at least this way we're choosing our risk instead of just reacting to his. Sarah had been quiet during this exchange, but now she spoke up. What if we're overthinking this? What if we just leave? Pack up tonight and drive to California or Oregon or somewhere he'll never find us? The suggestion hung in the air like a lead balloon. Emma could see the appeal of it, the simple solution of running away again, but she could also see the trap it represented. Then we spend the rest of our lives running, Emma said gently, always looking over our shoulders, always wondering when he'll show up again. Always starting over, never building anything permanent. Rebecca reached across the couch to take her sister's hand. Emma's right, Sarah. Running worked when we needed to get you safe quickly. But if we want to build a real life, we have to deal with this threat directly. How? Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. How do we deal with someone who won't accept that we have the right to our own lives? It was Jake who answered, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won experience. We set boundaries and enforce them. We make it clear that his old tactics won't work anymore, and we make the consequences of continued harassment too expensive for him to bear. You make it sound so simple, Sarah said. It's not simple, Jake admitted, but it is straightforward. The only reason Robert's been able to control your lives for so long is because he's never faced any real consequences for his behavior. It changes now. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with frost sparkling on the grass and the promise of another beautiful autumn day. Emma dressed for school with deliberate care, choosing clothes that made her feel confident and capable. She strapped on the small emergency radio David had given her and slipped the pepper spray Rebecca had purchased into her jacket pocket. The drive to school felt different this time, not just because David was driving his patrol vehicle instead of the family SUV, but because Emma herself felt different. She was no longer sneaking around hoping to avoid notice. She was presenting herself openly, daring Robert to make his move. Katie Walsh was waiting in the parking lot, and Emma could see immediately that word had spread about the situation. Several other students lingered nearby, not obviously, but close enough to provide witnesses and potential assistance if needed. How are you holding up? Katie asked as they walked toward the building. Better than I expected, Emma admitted. It's strange. I spent years being afraid of him, but now that I know he's coming, I'm not afraid anymore. I'm angry. Anger can be useful, Katie observed, as long as you don't let it make you careless. Principal Bradley met them at the entrance, his expression serious but supportive. Emma, I want you to know that every adult in this building is aware of the situation and prepared to respond if necessary. You're not handling this alone. The morning classes passed without incident, but Emma could feel the tension building like the pressure before a thunderstorm. Teachers were more alert than usual. Administrators made more frequent appearances in the hallways, and several parents had volunteered to help with hall monitoring. During lunch, Emma sat with Katie and her friends, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. The conversation was lighter than usual. Clearly everyone was making an effort to keep things normal for her benefit, but Emma appreciated the gesture. It was Tyler, the rodeo team captain, who first noticed the stranger. Don't look now, he said quietly, but there's a guy in the parking lot who doesn't belong here. Older, scruffy-looking, sitting in a beat-up truck. Emma's blood turned to ice water. What kind of truck? Blue Ford, maybe 15 years old. Dented up pretty good. That was Robert's truck. Emma forced herself to remain calm as she pulled out her emergency radio. David, this is Emma. Code yellow. Code yellow meant potential sighting, not an immediate threat, but requiring verification and response. David's voice crackled back immediately. Copy that. Stay put. We're en route. What's code yellow? Maria asked, but Katie shushed her. Everyone. Just act normal, Katie said quietly. "Emma, do you want to move away from the windows?" Emma considered this, then shook her head. "No. I want him to see me. I want him to know that I'm not hiding anymore." Through the cafeteria windows, Emma could see the truck Tyler had described. Even at this distance, she could make out the silhouette of the man behind the wheel, and her stomach confirmed what her mind already knew. After 15 years, she would recognize her father's profile anywhere. "He's just sitting there," Tyler observed. "What's he waiting for?" Emma thought she knew. Robert had always been calculating in his cruelty, preferring to build tension before striking. He would want her to see him, want her to spend the rest of the day in fear of what he might do. It was psychological warfare, the kind he'd waged against her and her mother for years, but this time Emma refused to play by his rules. "I'm going out there," she announced, standing up from the lunch table. "Emma, no," Katie said immediately. "That's exactly what he wants." "Maybe, but I'm not going to spend the rest of the day being afraid of him." Emma pulled out her radio again. "David, I'm going to make contact. Don't interfere unless he becomes physically aggressive." "Negative!" David's voice was sharp. "Stay inside until we arrive." "He's my father," Emma replied. "This is my fight." Before anyone could stop her, Emma walked out of the cafeteria and through the school's main entrance. She could hear Katie calling her name behind her, but she didn't turn around. Her focus was entirely on the man in the truck, the man who had terrorized her family for 15 years and was now trying to do it again. Robert saw her coming. She could see him straightening in the driver's seat, his hands moving to the steering wheel as if preparing to drive away. But he didn't leave. He waited, just as Emma had known he would. His ego wouldn't let him run from a confrontation with his own daughter. Emma stopped about 10 feet from the truck, close enough to talk, but far enough away to run if necessary. Robert rolled down his window, and she got her first clear look at him in 3 weeks. He looked terrible. His hair was unwashed and unkempt, his clothes wrinkled and stained. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't been sleeping well, and the smell of alcohol drifted from the truck even at this distance. But his eyes still held that same cruel intelligence that had made him so dangerous for so many years. "Hello, Emma," he said, his voice artificially calm. "You've grown up a lot in the past few weeks." "What do you want?" Emma asked, proud that her voice didn't shake. "I want my family back. I want my wife and daughter to come home where they belong. We don't belong with you anymore. We never belonged with you." Robert's mask of calm began to slip. "You don't know what you're saying. You're just a child. You don't understand the world. Don't understand what it takes to survive out here on your own." "I understand more than you think. I understand that normal fathers don't hit their wives. I understand that normal families don't live in fear every day. I understand that you're not our protector. You're the thing we needed protection from." "Those people have been filling your head with lies," Robert snarled. "I've supported you and your mother for 15 years, given you everything you needed. You gave us bruises and terror and broken bones," Emma interrupted. "You gave us nightmares and anxiety and a house where we couldn't breathe freely. That's not protection, that's torture." Robert's composure cracked completely, and Emma saw the familiar rage building in his eyes. "You ungrateful little—" "I'm not ungrateful," Emma said firmly. "I'm free, and I'm never going back to being your victim." Behind her, Emma heard the sound of approaching vehicles, David's patrol car, and what sounded like at least 2 others. Robert heard them too, and his expression shifted from rage to calculation. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "You can't hide behind these people forever. Sooner or later it'll just be you and me, and then we'll see how brave you really are." "I'm counting on it," Emma replied, and she meant it. Robert stared at her for a long moment, as if seeing her clearly for the first time in her life. Then he started the truck and drove away, leaving Emma standing in the school parking lot with her heart pounding and her hands shaking, but her spirit intact. David reached her first, his face a mixture of anger and admiration. "That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've ever seen," he said. "Maybe both," Emma admitted, "but I needed him to know that I'm not the same scared little girl he left behind in Cedar Falls." Jake appeared at her elbow, having arrived in the second vehicle. "You got that message across loud and clear. Question is, what's he going to do about it?" They didn't have to wait long for an answer. That evening, as the family sat down to dinner, David's phone rang with another update from law enforcement. Robert had checked out of his motel in Laramie and disappeared again, but this time he'd left behind a trail that suggested he wasn't going far. "He bought supplies," David reported grimly. "Camping gear, non-perishable food, extra fuel. Looks like he's planning to stay in the area for a while." Emma felt her mother tense beside her. "He's going to try to wait us out," Sarah said. "Make us prisoners in our own home until we give up and go back to him, or he's planning something more direct," Jake said quietly. Emma confronted him publicly today, made him lose face. "Men like Robert don't handle humiliation well." Rebecca set down her fork and looked around the table at her family, biological and chosen. "So what do we do?" Emma answered without hesitation. "We live our lives. We don't let him turn us into prisoners again. And when he makes his move, because we all know he will, we're ready for him." David nodded slowly. "Enhanced security protocols. Starting tonight, nobody goes anywhere alone. Everyone checks in every hour when away from the ranch, and we assume he's watching everything we do." As if to emphasize the point, the security lights outside suddenly flared to life, triggered by motion in the yard. Everyone froze, listening for sounds that would indicate an intruder. But after several tense minutes, they saw a deer emerge from the shadows, cropping grass peacefully near the fence line. "False alarm," David said, but Emma noticed he didn't relax completely. Later that evening, as Emma prepared for bed, she found herself standing at her bedroom window, looking out at the dark landscape beyond the security lights. Somewhere out there, Robert was planning his next move. But for the first time in her life, Emma wasn't afraid of what that move might be. She was ready for whatever came next. More importantly, she was no longer facing it alone. The sound of gravel crunching in the driveway below made her look down. Jake's truck was parked near the house. He'd been staying in the guest room since Robert's appearance in Laramie, providing an extra layer of security and an additional pair of experienced eyes. Emma thought about the conversation she'd had with Robert in the school parking lot, about the way his expression had changed when he realized she was no longer the terrified child he remembered. She'd seen something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Uncertainty, maybe even fear. For 15 years, Robert Hartwell had controlled his family through violence and intimidation. But his victims had learned to fight back. And that changed everything. As Emma finally turned away from the window and settled into bed, she felt a strange sense of peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, new tests of the courage she was still learning to trust. But tonight, surrounded by people who loved and protected her, she could sleep without nightmares. The storm had arrived, but they were ready for it. The attack came at dawn on a Saturday morning, 3 days after Emma's confrontation at the school. Robert chose his moment carefully. The weekend when the family's routines were less predictable. The early hour when security might be at its lowest ebb. Emma woke to the sound of glass breaking downstairs, followed immediately by her mother's scream. Years of living in fear had trained her to wake instantly at the first sign of trouble, and she was on her feet and moving before her conscious mind had fully processed what was happening. The house erupted into controlled chaos. David's voice boomed from the master bedroom, shouting tactical commands as he reached for his service weapon. Jake's door slammed open across the hall, and Emma could see him pulling on clothes while grabbing his rifle. Michael and Jessica appeared in their doorways, eyes wide but alert. Ranch kids learned early to respond quickly to emergencies. "Everyone stay upstairs," David commanded as he thundered down the stairs. "Emma, Sarah, bathroom now. Lock the door." But Emma had already reached her mother's room and found it empty. Through the window, she could see the source of the breaking glass. Robert had smashed the kitchen window and was already inside the house. "He's got Mom," Emma called out, her voice surprisingly steady. All those weeks of preparation, all those firearms lessons with Jake had led to this moment. Jake appeared beside her, rifle in hand. "Where?" "Kitchen." He came through the back window. From downstairs came the sound of furniture overturning, and Sarah's voice, raised in defiance rather than fear, a sound Emma had never heard before. Her mother was fighting back. "Stay here," Jake commanded, but Emma was already moving past him. "No, she's my mother." David was positioned at the bottom of the stairs, his weapon drawn but his line of sight blocked by the kitchen's position around the corner. The layout of the house that had always felt welcoming now worked against them, providing Robert with cover and multiple exit routes. "Let her go, Robert," David called out in his authoritative sheriff's voice. "It's over. End this before someone gets hurt." Robert's laugh echoed from the kitchen, harsh and bitter. "The only thing that's over is the charade. Sarah belongs to me. Emma belongs to me. I'm taking back what's mine." "We don't belong to anyone," Emma shouted, stepping into view at the top of the stairs. She had Jake's backup pistol in her hands, held exactly as he'd taught her, firm grip, proper stance, finger off the trigger until ready to fire. The sight of his daughter armed and ready to defend herself seemed to break something in Robert's mind. "You ungrateful little witch, after everything I've done for you." A crash from the kitchen suggested he'd thrown something, probably at Sarah. Emma heard her mother cry out, not in pain but in anger, and the sound galvanized her into action. She was halfway down the stairs before anyone could stop her, moving with the calm precision that emergency situations sometimes bring. David reached for her as she passed, but Emma shook her head. "He won't hurt me," she said quietly. "Not while there are witnesses, but he might hurt her if I don't give him what he really wants." "Which is what?" Jake asked, though his expression suggested he already knew. "A final confrontation. Him and me. The reckoning he's been building toward for 15 years. Emma stepped around the corner into the kitchen before anyone could argue with her decision. The room was in shambles, chairs overturned, dishes broken, the window gaping open where Robert had forced his entry. Her mother stood pressed against the far wall, a cut on her cheek from flying glass, but otherwise unharmed. Robert stood in the center of the destruction, and Emma was shocked by how diminished he looked. 3 weeks of drinking and sleeping rough had taken their toll. The man who had loomed so large in her nightmares looked smaller now, more pathetic than terrifying. His clothes were filthy, his face unshaven, his eyes bloodshot with exhaustion and rage. "There's my girl," he said, his voice taking on the fake gentleness that had always preceded his worst violence. "Come here, Emma, come to Daddy. I'm not your little girl anymore," Emma replied, keeping the pistol pointed at the floor but ready to raise it if needed. "And I'm not coming anywhere near. You don't have a choice," Robert snarled, grabbing Sarah's arm and pulling her against him. "Neither of you do. You're coming home with me right now or I start breaking bones." Emma saw her mother's face, and instead of the familiar fear, she saw determination. Sarah had changed too during their weeks of freedom. The woman who had once absorbed her husband's violence without complaint was gone, replaced by someone who had remembered her own strength. "Break whatever you want," Sarah said clearly. "We're never going back to being your victims." Robert's grip on her arm tightened, and Emma saw her mother wince. But Sarah didn't cry out, didn't beg, didn't give him the satisfaction of her fear. "You think these people care about you," Robert hissed. "You think they'll protect you when things get difficult. You're nothing to them. Charity cases, burdens they'll get tired of supporting." "They're more family to us than you ever were," Emma said. "They've shown us what love actually looks like, what protection actually means. What you gave us wasn't love. It was ownership." Something shifted in Robert's expression, and Emma recognized the look. It was the same cold calculation that had always preceded his most vicious attacks, the moment when he decided that words weren't enough and violence was required. But this time, Emma was ready for it. Robert shoved Sarah away from him and lunged toward Emma, his hands reaching for her throat with the same casual brutality he'd displayed for 15 years. But Emma was no longer the helpless child who had cowered before his rage. She sidestepped his charge, raised the pistol and fired a single shot into the floor at his feet. The gunshot was deafeningly loud in the enclosed kitchen, and Robert stumbled backward in shock. He'd never seen his daughter fight back before, never imagined she was capable of violence in her own defense. "The next one won't miss," Emma said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "Back away from my mother." For a moment, Robert looked like he might challenge her threat. Then David appeared in the kitchen doorway with his service weapon drawn, followed immediately by Jake with his rifle. The odds had shifted decisively against him. "It's over, Robert," David said firmly. "You're under arrest for breaking and entering, assault and violation of a restraining order." "I don't recognize any restraining order," Robert snarled. "Those are my wife and daughter. I have every right." "You have no rights here," Jake interrupted. "You lost those the first time you raised your hand to them." Robert's gaze darted around the kitchen, looking for an escape route or an advantage he could exploit. But he was surrounded, outnumbered, and facing people who were no longer afraid of him. "This isn't over," he said finally, "the old threat that had controlled the Hartwell women for so many years." "Yes, it is," Emma replied. "It's completely over. You have no power here." David moved forward with handcuffs, and Robert didn't resist. The fight had gone out of him the moment he realized that his former victims were no longer willing to be victimized. As David led him away to the patrol car, Robert tried one last manipulation. "Emma!" he called over his shoulder. "You'll regret this. Both of you will. You'll come crawling back when you realize what the real world is like." Emma looked at her father, this man who had defined her life through fear for 15 years, and felt nothing but pity. "The real world is beautiful," she said quietly. "It's full of people who know how to love without hurting. I'm sorry you never learned that." The patrol car pulled away, carrying Robert Hartwell toward a jail cell, and, eventually, toward the legal consequences that had been waiting for him for 15 years. Emma watched it disappear down the ranch road, then turned to help her mother clean up the broken glass. 6 months later, Emma stood on the graduation stage at Sweetwater High, accepting her diploma as valedictorian of her class. The audience was small, just family and friends, but the applause was heartfelt. Sarah sat in the front row beside Rebecca, both women crying happy tears as Emma delivered her valedictorian speech about second chances and the courage to build new lives. Robert had been sentenced to 5 years in prison for his crimes in Wyoming, with additional charges pending in Montana. His parole conditions would require him to stay away from his former family permanently. Emma knew he might try to contact them again someday, but she also knew that the terrified child who had once lived in fear of his anger was gone forever. Jake had proposed to Sarah on New Year's Eve, offering her not just love, but the kind of partnership she'd never experienced before. Their wedding was planned for the fall, a small ceremony at the ranch with Emma serving as maid of honor. Emma had been accepted to Colorado State University with a full scholarship, planning to study veterinary medicine with the goal of returning to Sweetwater to serve the ranching community that had become her home. She would live in the dorms during the week, but come home to the ranch on weekends, maintaining the connections that had saved her life. As she stood at the podium, looking out at the faces of people who had become her chosen family, Emma thought about the journey that had brought her here. It had started with a terrified mother and daughter fleeing in the night, carrying nothing but hope and the clothes on their backs. It had ended with two strong women who had learned to fight for themselves, surrounded by a community that had embraced them not as charity cases, but as valued members. They had built new identities based not on survival, but on growth, not on fear, but on possibility. The Old West was built by people who had the courage to leave behind everything they knew in search of something better, Emma said, concluding her speech. Today, I want to honor all the modern pioneers who still have that courage, the ones who refuse to accept that things have to stay the way they've always been, who dare to imagine better lives for themselves and their children. She looked directly at her mother and aunt in the front row. Thank you for teaching me that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be. As the ceremony ended and families gathered for photographs, Emma felt Jake's presence beside her. He'd become more than her firearms instructor and her mother's fiancé. He'd become the father figure she'd never had, the one who protected through strength rather than controlling through fear. Proud of you, he said simply, his words carrying more weight than any elaborate praise. Thank you, Emma replied, for everything, for showing us there was another way. Jake tipped his hat, a gesture that had become familiar and comforting. You saved yourselves. I just provided the transportation. That evening, the extended family gathered on the ranch's back porch to watch the sunset David had promised would be the best view in 3 counties. Emma sat between her mother and her aunt, surrounded by the sounds of normal family life. Michael and Jessica arguing good-naturedly about summer plans, Sam chattering about his upcoming baseball season, Rebecca and David discussing improvements to the ranch. The sky exploded in shades of gold and crimson as the sun dropped behind the mountains, painting the landscape in colors that still took Emma's breath away. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack, a wild sound that spoke of freedom and endless possibility. Emma thought about the girl she'd been just months ago, afraid, isolated, convinced that her life would never be anything more than survival. That girl felt like a stranger now, someone from another lifetime entirely. The woman she'd become was just beginning to discover what she was capable of becoming. And for the first time in her life, that future stretched ahead of her bright with a promise unlimited by fear and rich with the knowledge that she would never again have to face the world alone. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Emma made a silent promise to the terrified 15-year-old who had packed a suitcase on that desperate night in Cedar Falls. She would live the life that girl had dreamed of, but never dared believe was possible. She would be happy, successful, and free. Most importantly, she would never forget that sometimes salvation comes in the form of a stranger's kindness, a sister's love, and the courage to believe that tomorrow can be different from yesterday. The gentle cowboy who had given them new life had also given them new names, not legal names, but the names that mattered most: survivor, fighter, free woman, family. Emma Hartwell was gone forever. In her place stood someone stronger, braver, and infinitely more hopeful, someone ready to ride into whatever sunset awaited her. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.